Welcome to this discussion on the future roles of universities worldwide, moving beyond the ivory tower, ? And it occurs to me that our subject really is a perfect one to engage here at the Pardee Center with its focus on the longer range future. The future not in the sense of next year or 5 years, but rather 10, 20, 40 years out. And our agenda this afternoon is to tackle a pair of hotly contested questions. First, what should be the future roles of universities worldwide? And then pairing with that, how can we achieve those advocated futures? What factors will determine the actual role of universities globally in the future? So in effect, we're asking our panelists to be both advocates and predictors of future trends. And I'd like to introduce our distinguished panel in the order that they will speak. First, Philip Altbach, who is director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College. He also is professor in the School of Education at BC. Dr. Altbach is a pioneering leader who's elevated research about global dimensions of higher education. His center is a primary resource, a real go-to resource, both for policymakers as well as academics about international trends in our sector. He's a prolific author, most recently co-wrote an influential World Bank report entitled The Roads to Academic Excellence, the Making of World-Class Research Universities. Hardin Coleman, who will be joining us very shortly, is the Dean of the School of Education at Boston University. He's also professor of counseling psychology. Dr. Coleman is a specialist in sociocultural factors in minority student achievement, and community engagement is, in fact, a distinctive strength of the school that he leads. Indeed, the School of Education at BU's strong commitment to external collaborations is a major reason why Dr. Coleman decided to accept the deanship. Sally Sustowitz, to my far left, is director of the Public Service Center at MIT. She and the center that she directs, and has directed since the year 2000, are pioneering leaders in the whole university public service movement, both in the US and internationally. And a hallmark of Sally Sustowitz's leadership is the development of a series of programs that advance both the education of students and at the same time aim to achieve long-term improvements in community conditions. As Cynthia mentioned earlier, I'm Rob Hollister, founding Dean Emeritus of the Tisch College of Citizenship and Public Service at Tufts University. The Tisch College is a university-wide school with a role in coordinating and driving a civic engagement initiative that involves transforming the curricula of all schools of the university. And I'm delighted to be affiliated with the Pardee Center this year as a visiting faculty fellow. And what motivated me to organize this panel is that I direct the Tawar Network, which is a growing global coalition of universities that are moving beyond the ivory tower. Our alliance now numbers 230 members in 62 countries with a combined enrollment of over 6 million students. So, Professor Altbach, will you please start us off? What's the future look like? What should it look like with respect to our topic?
Good. And I'm going to do all this in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Which is what I was asked to do. Maybe a little more than 5 minutes. To view the future, you have to look at the past. So I'm going to talk about mainly what's happened in the last 20 years in higher education and project that out not to the long-term future, I think, but to the coming period of the next 20, 30 years, because I think the trends which I'm going to be talking about are central to what's happening now and what will happen in the future. To me, there are a number of elements. I'm going to deal with 3 of the ones that I think are most important and talk very briefly about some of the details of them. The major global driver of higher education development since really the 1960s and on up until the present, affecting different countries in different ways, but affecting us all, is what the Europeans call massification, growth. All else stems from that. Everything else. Now, there are other elements too, like the development of IT, which is fairly new in higher education. But the trend toward mass higher education is the underlying pattern. Once upon a time, in most of our lifetimes, most higher education systems enrolled, believe it or not, about 5% of the relevant age group. The United States and Canada were the first countries to become mass higher education systems. In our case, starting in the 1930s. So we've had the longest experience with developing a system to cope with mass higher ed. And that's one of the key reasons, I think, why other countries look to the U.S. as kind of a model. And we've done it overall pretty well over time. 20 years ago, there were 100 million students worldwide. Now there are 175 million students worldwide. 20 years. The growth patterns you can see clearly in the enrollment rates in different countries. And they are clear from around the world. Most of the rich countries now enroll 70 to 80% of the relevant age group. That's true in Western Europe. It's true in Russia. It's beginning to be true in the Eastern European countries. And that seems to be the kind of upper limit of the relevant age group. Now, it becomes complicated because, so-called non-traditional students in many countries are taking advantage of higher education opportunities, and systems are changing to deal with them. The region of the world with the lowest enrollment ratio is Africa, which is still, except for South Africa and a few of the northern African countries, under 10%, a tremendous growth to take place. The pattern in Latin America has been remarkable growth. Most of those countries are in the 30% up. And Asia, it's a mixed picture. And the 2 Asian giants, India and China, India now enrolls about 10% of its age cohort in higher education. China about 22%, with, of course, both of them huge population bases. Half the enrollment growth in the coming 20, 30 years will be just in those 2 countries alone, because both countries have as national policies increasing access in the Chinese case to about 60% in the coming 20 years, and in the Indian case they don't have they haven't developed a number yet, but it's in that level. So massification. What has massification meant? It's meant overall lower quality. No question about that. It doesn't mean that the whole system is lower quality. It means that on average, the quality is lower. It will surprise you, and the following comment is based on just a back of the envelope estimate by me, not on real research. The average person who is today standing before a class in a post-secondary institution has as his or her degree qualification a bachelor's degree. So the quality of the academic profession has gone down, at least in terms of qualifications. And almost all countries are very much concerned about that and trying to do something about it. But that's an element. Overall quality declined. Systems become within themselves more unequal. You've got at the top research universities almost everywhere as a tiny part of a big system, and a gulf between those world-class, or at least regional class institutions, and the mass part of a national higher education system. So too, inequalities globally. And you just look at the rankings, whatever you want to make of them, and there are problems in the several global higher education rankings. Very few developing countries among them. For that matter, very few Chinese universities among them, and no Indian universities in the top 100. Some of them think that the Indian Institute of Technology, which by the way isn't a university, it's a special, very fine set of specialized institutions, are up there, but none of the main Indian universities. So inequality, we've also seen the rise of the private sector, and that is, in fact, globally, the private sector is the fastest growing part in these mass higher education systems, because the state either cannot afford or feels that it cannot afford to fund enrollment growth in the public sector. So we've seen the rise of the private sector. Most of the private sector, quite unlike the United States, is low end and for profit, and has severe quality problems. So developing a private sector, which is inevitable, in the public interest, as I like to put it, is a key challenge for higher education systems. Okay, enough about massification. Another key driver is globalization, obviously. And that has many elements to it. Part of it is the global knowledge economy, economic integration. Part of it is the ease of air travel and IT, which makes it easier for students and faculty to move from country to country. And we now have this tremendous sucking sound, which is taking many of the best scholars from the developing world and plunking them in the rich countries, especially in the United States, which is more open to kind of a multicultural academic profession and student body. So globalization has many elements to it. I don't have time to discuss them here. Branch campuses, student mobility, franchising, agents and recruiters, you name it. It's very much part of the global scene, much of it promising, much of it problematical at the same time. So internationalization is very much part of the trend. How do we create a higher education system that is concerned with the public good? Because that's declining. The private sector, as I mentioned, is largely for profit around the world and is not concerned with the public good. How do you maintain quality in that new private sector? Deep problem in many different countries. Quality assurance is a key challenge in much of the world, and so on. I think I'll stop at that point. I've identified two big issues: massification and globalization, and each of them has a wide range of implications to them.
Thanks very much for setting the context for us so well. Dean Coleman, could we ask your your opening comments? Again, our agenda is a pair of questions. What should be the future of the future roles of universities worldwide? And then how do we get there? What are the factors that will actually determine the future of that dimension of higher education? But welcome.
Again, I apologize for being late. I had a meeting with my boss that took a long time to get, and we got in deep arguments about the future of my school. So, discussion, passionate discussion. So, I'm enjoying being in an academic setting now. So, I want to start with a seemingly Luddite comment, and say that I think the future of higher education is one that it's always had. First and foremost, universities are central to the economic region in which they reside. In Boston, this is obvious. I spent 17 years in Wisconsin, and the UW-Madison returned $3 in economic development to the state for every dollar the state invested in the university. So that return is phenomenal and very important and central to what universities do. The initial contribution of universities is to give faculty the time to think of new and innovative ideas that can lead to new products and services that then get translated into economic development. The second is to prepare undergraduates to join the civil society. So the responsibility of having a literate and numerate population is phenomenal. And then graduate students who learn how to generate those new and innovative ideas that allow them to become the next generation of faculty. But as Phil has pointed out, the quality of the actual university is significant in whether that is able to continue to be an economic value. I want to argue that engaged universities take seriously their role in building cultural, social, and economic capital within the region in which they reside. This is an argument for thinking of universities as significantly place-based. At the end of the day, where you are physically and how you generate economic well-being in that place is very central to the future of all universities and, I think, civil society. Engaged universities actually reach out to incubate talent and civility. By that I mean we not only reach out to pre-college and find good talent to bring them in to nurture them, but also when I think civility within the community, I think a more educated populace is more able to negotiate the type of conflicts that naturally arrive in any economically changing environment. Schools of education tend to be deeply involved in this process, both through preparing the next generation of teachers. The data all shows that teachers usually work within 60 miles of where they got trained. So teachers tend to be tremendously place-based individuals where they get their clinical training and they stay. That's where they're certified and they stay. So schools of education in geographic regions have a phenomenal impact. Also, schools of education provide ongoing professional development to teachers in practice. A central role of any school of education is the ability to make sure that the current generation of teachers is improving and staying on top. And then finally, to produce scholarship that serves to improve educational practice, which we disseminate through the teachers we train. So schools of education, I think, as in terms of what an engaged university do, is, I'm going to argue, obviously with great self-interest, that we are the model of how universities can function, where we work on content development, but also teaching people the practical skills of making change within their place space. At this school of education, we define our region both locally and internationally. So we're in an interesting dynamic where we're very active in our local regions, kind of larger New England, as we work to prepare master teachers for New England. But we also have significant relationships in international settings where we're trying to replicate the service we provide here, both in India, China, and we're opening a new program with Indonesia. And we have a couple examples of the work that we do about engagement, where Charlie White, one of our professors, is deeply involved in training middle school kids how to take on local problems. And there's an international organization called Civitas, in which he's very involved, which actually trains teachers how to get middle school kids to understand problems in the community, develop solutions, and put them into practice. And so if you ever go to the website, the one I particularly enjoy is tribe in Africa, a village in Africa, where the adolescents created potable water sources for a town that was being devastated by the diseases that were in their local river. Scott Sider is one of our professors working on research in character education, looking at the role of developing character when you think about engaged in creating civil societies. What is the role of character or social emotional learning in K-12 education? As you read the papers, we tend to talk much more about MCAS scores or accountability. What Scott Sider has found is that the three highest performing charter schools in this city all have explicit programs in character education development, and that they see that as central to their ability for students to stay engaged and perform academically. Charlie Glenn works around the world, particularly in the European Union, on the issues of accountability. So one of the things that I think schools of education are deeply involved in is thinking about what are the outcomes of a university and how do we hold academic institutions accountable for those outcomes. And finally, most universities, good schools of education, universities, have people like Ruth Shane, who's been running the Boston Public School Collaborative, which was established 30 years ago in response to desegregation issues in Boston, where the acknowledgement was that teachers had to learn how to manage this now diverse student population, and has gone up and down. But she's particularly responsible for Upward Bound program, which is a national program that recruits highly talented youth and provides them pre-college training so they're prepared to go to college. And then she supports Boston's Scholar program, which is one of these unique and very special programs where anyone from the Boston area who's qualified to get into BU, who grew up in Boston, gets a very significant scholarship opportunities to be here, and Ruth nurtures them as they go through. So repeating, an engaged university is one that recruits talent, trains talents, and nurtures its ability to join in appropriate levels to civil society.
Exciting vision. And indeed, it's a vision that you and your colleagues are actively implementing. We've agreed beforehand, Sally Susnowitz has a gift at being a very productive cleanup hitter, and so that I'll go next, and she will finish up our opening comments. I mentioned earlier that the focus of my work is this group called the Tawar Network, which is an alliance of universities that have a common goal, which is to move beyond the ivory tower to tackle pressing community problems. So our members on all continents are trying a broad array of approaches to mobilizing their human resources and their expertise, to mobilize their professors and their students, but also their knowledge to directly address pressing issues, economic, social, environmental. So it's a dual commitment, if you will. Improve community conditions, but find ways to do that in the process develop their students to be leaders for change. So our global network is committed to educating citizen engineers, citizen pediatricians, citizen businesswomen, people who are first and foremost very good at their chosen field, but who also weave into their patterns of professional practice a commitment and the skills to use their professional talents to build healthy, productive communities and societies. So our collective vision, and it's not my vision, it's the vision of the universities that are members of our group, our vision is that a decisive majority of universities worldwide actively collaborate with the communities in which they're located. Our vision is that institutions of higher education in all parts of the world become dramatically more effective engines of social and economic development, that they systematically partner with NGOs, with local and national governments, and with private businesses, and that the gold standard of higher education become the engaged university, one that demonstrates high impact on community conditions and positive impact on elevating academic quality. Our belief is that those are not in conflict, but that if you're clever about it, you can in fact advance both community impact and academic excellence. And we believe strongly, our experience tells us, that this is not a fantasy. This is a practical vision, because indeed it is already happening around the world. And what's exciting about this movement that our members in Thailand, in Malaysia, in the Sudan, in Vietnam, in Ukraine, in Canada, and the United States, is that this movement of university engagement, of moving beyond the ivory tower, is important and exciting because it's simultaneously achieving three big-ticket results: higher quality education, deep community impact, and, apropos of some of what you were mentioning, Phil, as a result of better education and greater positive impacts on society, a third key result: increased public support for higher education. So important in periods of rapid university expansion and extraordinary underinvestment by public agencies in higher education. So that's the vision that we have. It's a phenomenon that is happening, but indeed, apropos of our topic, a question mark about what the future holds. Easy for me to say, a decisive majority of universities worldwide will be engaged. I believe strongly that that's a possible future, but it is indeed not an automatic future. Sally Susnowitz, your thoughts?
My first thought is I'm very glad that we agreed to focus on where we disagree, because I think it's a very ripe field, don't you, just already? And I'm going to try to add a little spice to that by making a few remarks. I'd like to talk with you about the students. I've heard the institution, faculty, and the community. And let's focus for a minute on the student part of the university, because I think that's very interesting when we talk about the future, because that's who's going to carry on the far distant future. So one concept that I think is really critical is the idea of collaborative education. I think at this point, students are collaborating in their own education, and they're going to continue to do it. So when I think of the University of the Future, I think of many student-driven initiatives. And this comes in part through things. I am at MIT. We're experimenting with things now. We've had the Undergraduate Research Opportunities Program for years. It's that revelation that undergraduates can, in fact, do research. When they become graduate students and professors, they'll get more experienced at it, but they're on that trajectory. Why not engage them and have them learn by doing it? And I think that idea of collaborative education extends into my area, which is public service. We send individuals often out into the field to work with a particular community on issues important to that community, and those students are being educated by that community in the same way that community is being educated by those students. So we're seeing this breadth of educational opportunity come through the activities of students themselves. Second concept is, to follow on that first, is that idea of experiential education. I hear often people talking about this global economy and the way students need to be able to function in it, and I would argue that the best way for them to learn that is to pay close attention to their academic work and to engage in some of the global experiences available to them, so that they really understand what it takes to work in other cultures, by other people's systems, within environments created by other people and with those people, and to do it effectively and respectfully. And the third concept I would raise is just IT, communication technology. It's going to make universities different in the future, and it's a worthwhile experiment to see how much we can evolve it by starting now working with communication technology in interesting new ways. So that when we send our students out in the field, and this is an experiment that's currently starting at MIT, they can work backward to connect with the residential university. So MIT is not giving up the residential university concept. But we do want people to be able to go out and work in these other communities. How then can they stay connected? And that's an interesting issue that I think universities need to solve. And when I speak, I think about MIT as my home base and other American universities, because that's what I know best. But also I see contacts at international universities becoming very interested in these same kinds of opportunities and ways of educating their students, in part through the Tawar Network. So I'm seeing an opportunity here where you have global awareness being a priority for students, not only from American universities going abroad, but internationally, where students in one country may wish to take advantage of intercultural experiences in others. That idea of field experience, trying things, getting your hands dirty, doing the experiments, getting involved in internships and externships and public service. So you have some challenge of knowing what you're doing early on, so you can find out what you now need to go back and know more about within your university experience. Maintaining that connection to a residential campus, I think there's something very important about that. But also having this idea of extended reciprocity. And so when I think about the future 40 years out, I think MIT is doing a very interesting experiment this spring with something called MITx. It's partly a way of connecting with the students who are in the field, but it's partly a way of opening up the university via communication technology to anyone interested in taking courses interactively with MIT. How will this work? I have no idea, and I don't think anyone at MIT does, and I know I'm being filmed, but I think we'll figure it out, and I think it's an interesting experiment. So I'm seeing the University of the Future as a facilitator or a convener, a responsible entity in higher education, quite aware that research is not entirely the purview of faculty members of that university. And I'm just seeing this opportunity for breadth of education that universities will be very central in making happen.
Sally, thank you. Phil, three of us on the panel have espoused different versions of university engagement as our preferred images of the future. You started us off by reminding us of some very strong trends and drivers, massification and globalization. How will those and other factors influence whether some version of our optimistic views of the future, in fact, come to pass?
Yes, I have several reactions. Keep in mind, I'm a kind of a half glass empty sort of person about life, but also about higher education. I think that the vision which is being espoused here is a vision of the elite. And yes, it's going to have an impact among small numbers of institutions and students in most countries, and you can find very good evidence everywhere of far-thinking people like this panel, at least three of us on this panel, three of you on the panel, who are thinking through these issues and trying, experimenting with a vision that sort of goes beyond where we are now. However, let's be realistic. You mentioned that the Tawar Network has a couple hundred, some hundreds of institutions involved in it. Nobody knows how many universities there are in the world today. Best guess, 50,000. If you add, I shouldn't say universities, I should say post-secondary institutions. Mm-hmm. The number of universities, less than that number. If you include the Indian undergraduate colleges, which are post-secondary institutions, that doubles the number. There are 40,000 undergraduate colleges in India, one country. So we are talking about a tiny proportion of the total. We were talking a bit about students. Let's ask the question, how are students admitted to university worldwide? There are two ways, largely. One of them is, and this is a Latin American model, and my favorite kind of whipping person on this matter is the UBA, the University of Buenos Aires, where by law, and this is true in a number of Latin American countries, if you graduate from high school with the appropriate leaving certificate, you have the right to enter a public university. They can't keep you out. What does the UBA do? It flunks out about 70% of the entering students every year. That's they don't quite say it's the policy, but it's been the practice over a long period of time. So most students who enter don't complete. We have in this country, as you know, President Obama himself has said this, a serious problem of non-completion or too long completion. Not a problem for the institutions at this table, but it's a national problem, and it's a global problem. The other way that students are admitted to university is a winner-take-all one exam. The Gaokao, the National Entrance Examination in China, which is taken every year by the largest number of students who sit for an exam in the world, determines one exam your entire academic future, or lack of it. What kind of institution you get into, if you get into any institution, etc. So we are far away from this vision. Vision's great, and I'm in favor of elites, and it's good that at least some parts of the population are able to take advantage of these good things, but this is not the pattern that you can see globally. One other issue, again in response, which is civic values, which we've all espoused, of central importance. The growth of commercialization, the growth of the private sector, which, as I've said, is largely a for-profit private sector. The United States is very much an anomaly in this case, where although we have a rapidly growing for-profit sector, still the private sector is largely not-for-profit and interested in the public interest and doing a good job. And I don't know what I would say about the for-profit sector, even in this country, with regard to those variables. But civic value, civic interest, the broader public good, has a decreasing role in higher education worldwide in this new private sector and in the growing privatization of the public institutions. One of us said that there needs to be investment from the state, from the society, in higher education. In many societies, dramatically this one, but much of the English-speaking world, a little bit less Western Europe, and mixed picture elsewhere, the actual percentage of GDP that goes to higher education is declining. Now, in those countries, numbers are not dramatically increasing. They're going up a bit, but the proportion of public resources going to higher education is declining. And we can see that in what's happening to the public universities in America, and there's similarly the case. We were recently looking at, and Mr. Stanfield in the audience was helping us with this, looking at how GDP expenditure on higher education in the BRIC countries, Brazil, India, China, Russia. In each of them, it's half what we invest here. It's significantly under what's invested in Western Europe. Like in healthcare in America, we spend the most in the world on higher education too. We're an expensive operation, not just the private sector, but the publics too. The rapidly growing economies are dramatically underspending. They do understand that, and China anyway has made some efforts to improve, but they're still way behind the the global curve. So I like to throw water on nice conversation. So here's some cold water.
Feeling great. So I feel you're arguing nice vision, but not very realistic. An elite vision, one that could, even if wildly successful, would only penetrate a small fraction of the higher education sector. Thoughts in response to that challenge, Sally? Pardon?
Ha.
Well said, Phil.
I think, I guess what I was envisioning is that these university models that we currently are using that are negative in these ways that you describe, and I completely believe the accuracy of Phil's statements, may not be, if possible, the road of the future. That there are ways where, and again, it's how open things are. You know, cell phones, computers are not everywhere, but cell phones seem to be prevalent widely, even in the poorest areas. Utilizing cell phone technology to enable people to learn and to do their own participation in research. That seems completely feasible, and we're seeing it happen. So community participation in research with universities as partners in it, students learning by working with communities to solve issues. I see these as inroads to the future of education, in which universities are participants, but not sequestered groups of individuals who are elite in the way that you described.
Yeah, and to add briefly to that, and I have a broad question both for us and because I know there's some people in the audience who have deep expertise on these issues, about IT and its role in higher education. The IT revolution actually, in my view, has been less dramatic than many people thought it would be up to the present time. It's always in the future. And I don't exactly know why, because the technology is pretty good by now. But there have been lots of failures in trying to do IT-based higher education. If you take a list of the largest distance education universities in the world, 8 of the top 10 are in developing countries. China, India, 2 of them in Thailand, 2 of them in Turkey, and 1 or 2 others. Only 2, the British Open University, and I'm forgetting the other one.
University of Phoenix in this country?
No, because the University of Phoenix is partly distance, but mostly, actually, site-based. Are in developing countries. So there is an important future for distance education using IT. I'm not clear exactly how that's going to work itself out. And you've got, on the one hand, high-class experiments, like what MIT has been doing in its several iterations in the last few years. And then you've got what some of these, and they're all public, by the way, developing country distance institutions are doing, and nobody quite knows the quality of them. But most reports say they're not too bad.
Hardin, an elite, unrealistic vision, or one that's attainable?
Well, I think I agree with your assessment of the problem, Phil, but I think our role is maybe to think more explicitly about how universities, elite universities, can take a role in the education of the next generation, both of the college and the PK-12 teachers, because that's where, obviously from my perspective, where you get the virtuous cycle of we need to be doing more training, how do we engage using distance technology or cohort-based education in the development of the next generation of doctoral students in those countries so that they can use the advantage we have. And also I think the PK-12 teachers. So using your example of technology in the United States, when you look at our public schools, you see this huge spread of technology in the schools, the wealthier the school district. So West Boston has a great technology not available in other parts of the country. But what you're seeing with this shrinking of cell phones, smartphones, the accessibility of that technology is right when it becomes affordable or scalable to integrate our curriculums into that format. So textbooks and iPads, et cetera. I think that's when the technology is going to catch up to the ability to spread that information.
Phil, one of the reasons I have a more optimistic view of the future of my cherished vision is the strength of student and the influence over time of demand from students and demand from employers. I hear from students and part of what's wonderful about the Tawar Network is it's a very diverse group in terms of where those institutions fit into the academic pecking order. It includes some elite world-class research universities, but many others that have that are much lower down in the pecking order and in what I'm sure you would agree is a very differentiated, very segmented sector in all countries. And I hear from students, including those in very non-elite universities, that part of why they participate in the community engagement activities of their universities is that it is experiential learning, that they are learning more, that they are gaining skills that will serve them well when they compete for employment. And similarly, the Tawar Network is involved in co-designing with the MasterCard Foundation a major program of demonstration projects to strengthen how universities in different parts of the world prepare students for employment and for effective entrepreneurship, and tapping their community engagement programs as a vehicle for that quest. We hear all the time, as we've been putting together this initiative, from employers that the same voices that I'm sure that you all have heard as well. The employers who look at our institutions of higher education saying, you're turning out unemployable graduates. You're educating people who they may have some good technical skills, but they're deficient in the soft skills and the organizing skills and the problem-solving skills that we need in our growing companies. So I think there is a way in which the demand from employers and from students can be at least a partial counter to the trends that you've mentioned. But let me just use this as a segue then to hearing from the rest of you. What is possible, what's desirable, what's possible, what strategies would you advocate? John Hammock. And if you'd be so kind as to identify yourselves, and while the microphone doesn't project, it is recording, so please do speak into it.
I'm John Hammock from the Fletcher School and also from here.
A little louder, please.
I'm John Hammock from the Fletcher School and also from here at the Pardee Center. I really, Rob, want to take issue a bit with the students that I talk to are caught in a double bind right now. First, there's one trend, and that is that not only are schools more private, but they're also more privatized, and they've also gotten incredibly more expensive. And in order to go to school, people are all taking out loans, and so they're all graduating with loans, which means that they all are trying to have skills that will be sellable in the marketplace. So instead of having other skills like academic, they're actually looking for very hard skills, which changes the nature of academia. But secondly, it means that they come out as indentured servants and can't really go out and do what they want to do. They have to go out and get a job in Wall Street or someplace that's going to make them money to pay off their loans. And so it's having a tremendous detrimental effect on people being able to do what they want, or idealism. And that's happening at the exact same time with another trend which you haven't mentioned at all. It was mentioned the fact that there's decreasing education funding, but it's also a time when the economy's tanked and there are no jobs. And so and I think unless we really deal with those issues, which are the fact that students are really in a bind, and the fact that our economy isn't there to help us to have the university. I think the university has to really be thinking of radically new ways of approaching this and looking at not just radical ways of teaching, but then also radical ways of doing advocacy in the world about why education is important and those public dollars need to go back up. Because unless that's done, I think the private sector is going to continue to churn out really bad quality education. And these visions are great, but ultimately what we need is some real practical work out there to change government policy.
Comments? Sally, Hardin, Phil?
Well, one of the questions that everyone's asking when the other idea of future is this a commitment to a 4-year bachelor's degree. Do you really need 4 years to become a competent major in English, as opposed to the 5 years you may need to be a competent engineer, and how universities may have to reconsider the way we structure ourselves based on the employment aspirations of our students. And with that comes the demand to have maybe much more focus on the growing need for clinical applications of what one's learning as built into the academic program. I think most major universities in 5-10 years are going to have very active programs. So the Honors College here is a good example of the attempt to make sure that people are integrating the knowledge acquisition with some practical skills, whether towards research. Certainly Sargent, the rehabilitation centers have been doing that, but that's going to be more part of our liberal education than we have done historically, so that people do come out with both the ability to apply the content they've learned so they are more employable. The financial end is a nightmare. I mean, I just don't know what we're going to do. I like to think about it. At 1975, when you graduated from a private college, you paid $5,000 for that year in school, and you paid $5,000 for a BMW. You now spend $55,000 at a private school and $55,000 for a BMW. But somehow we've inflated inappropriately. And so I think that's, again, part of our understanding of the value of education as part of the economic good. And we have to be much better at public policy arguments, which as academics we don't always succeed at, as advocating that we are valued to society, and the price tag is worth it because it generates jobs and innovation and ideas.
David Luberoff, you run a very innovative university-based center that's in the business of applied research to improve public policies locally. Your thoughts on this topic?
I mean, first, thank you for a really interesting conversation. The test is always at some point when I start pull out my pad and start scribbling notes down. A couple of just reactions in no particular order. I was struck, think about the title here about moving beyond the ivory tower, and there are really two very different themes, some of which you highlighted, right? One is kind of the moving beyond the ivory tower because students are trying, the purpose of higher education has been to give you marketable skills and kind of the old Northeastern University model. Yep. Right, that we're going to get you co-op jobs. That, in many respects, is very different than a model about the creating engaged citizens, which is really what you've been talking about, Rob. And there's an interesting tension in there that I just wanted to sort of highlight in terms of what we think the role of the university. I think this also relates to, I suspect, as we look down that spectrum of the non-elite universities, that they tend to focus much more on harder sort of training skills than what we think of as the liberal arts. I'm very struck in this conversation, this is my second point, relates to the first, by I haven't heard much about the traditional liberal arts curriculum. It just came up a little bit here, but what's the role for teaching people Shakespeare or art? And how does that relate to this? I mean, I have my own thoughts on this. And, you know, interestingly, if we look at the panel, if I heard right, 2 people from schools of education, 1 person from kind of an office of civic engagement. Rob, I guess you sort of get to represent all of the rest of the liberal arts. Certainly within my university, there's sometimes a tension between the School of Education and, say, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And so where is that in the conversation?
Let me stop. Actually,
yeah, I'm gonna stop there. I had a couple other I had a couple of other points, but those to me, you know, where are the liberal arts and what is it that we're trying to move beyond I think are really the two biggies. I had a couple
What are we
lesser
trying to move
thoughts.
beyond, and where's the liberal arts fit in?
Yeah, a brief comment about the liberal arts. It's interesting you asked the question because globally, the liberal arts is attracting a good deal of interest at the moment, not because anybody's interested in Shakespeare particularly, or for that matter, studying the Bhagavad Gita or other things of that sort, but because universities are seen as not producing critical thinkers. And general education and the liberal arts are conflated into critical thinking. I mean, we could have a discussion about that too. But that's how it's seen, especially in China at the moment, but also in other places. And the elite universities around the world, a lot in China, are instituting some kind of general education requirement as a way of ensuring that their graduates have the, as you said, the soft skills, and an understanding that in the global knowledge economy, training to be an electrical engineer may not be where you spend the rest of your employment life. So all of these are deeply problematical in terms of how to organize them in a system, in most systems, that have been, unlike the US system, that have been at the undergraduate level very vocational. And in a mass higher ed system, do a pretty bad job of training people even for existing vocational positions. In India, for example, and Americans are frequently saying, oh, how many engineers are we graduating, and look at all the many thousands they're graduating in India. True, but most of those engineers are unemployable. And the big IT companies like Infosys have their own universities, which they take the brighter of the engineers and they retrain them because what they're getting out of the colleges is not sufficient. That's kind of, I don't know where that leaves your very good question, but it's sort of musings on the role of the liberal arts, because we are beginning to realize that higher education is more than vocational training, that the nation of a vocation, a job, has changed in the global knowledge economy. It may no longer exist in a particular industry, and it may no longer exist in a particular country. And the soft skills, the critical thinking, the way to work in a complex environment, the way to work cross-culturally, all of these things are of central importance, which are not provided in most undergraduate curricula in most of the world.
And just to add on that, to pick up a point that Phil mentioned, the idea of working cross-culturally implies that you have knowledge of your own culture. And I think that's where the liberal arts education is very important. And also that idea of being able to function. I mean, civic engagement doesn't just mean doing outreach or working for the public good. It also means upholding your cultural standards and fitting into them. And those who are ignorant of liberal arts may, in fact, find that they don't fit and can't move forward.
There's been some important, a thread in the discussion has been what indeed are the financial realities in terms of public investment, but also the realities of the vast majority of individual students. And let me invite questions or comments about the underlying economic or financial model. Catherine Donaher?
Well, I mean, from my perspective, the financial model isn't working. I think John Hammock made that point very effectively, that if you have a situation where you have people at 18 going into college with a great deal of enthusiasm and expectation, and yet find 4 years later they come out and that their future is constrained. I mean, I watched my own children come out of college and they and their friends be constrained by the fact that at that time, we've made a little progress here in Massachusetts, they had to make choices based on health insurance. I mean, What kind of a society is that? That's not an educational problem, but it's a huge educational problem in terms of how you use and employ, these precious resources, which are well-educated young people. So it seems to me that, and I think the forces coming out of technology are going to have an enormous impact on how students make choices about how they invest their education dollars. They're going to have many more options than we did, and even our children, who are now in their 20s and 30s, had. And I think they're going to be smarter about it than many of the people running the institutions, because they're smarter about technology. So there'll be a whole new demand sector coming up. And I think if I were running a university right now, I'd be investing a lot in thinking about those issues.
Thanks. Please, Tony.
I'm Tony Braw. I'm an independent researcher and consultant in higher education. This past Sunday's New York Times article had a huge impact on some of my thinking quite recently, and it was about Apple products in particular. And to summarize very briefly, it was trying to raise the question of why were the Apple products that were completely 100% assembled in Silicon Valley in 2002.
Tony, could you actually stand and talk a little louder so that everybody can hear?
I was reflecting on the New York Times article about Apple, and that Apple products in 2002, at any rate, with this, were almost entirely made, and it was part of pride of the company that they were made in the United States. And by 2004, 2 years later, the particular plants that had made these products were no longer in existence. They were 100% being made in China. And the discussion in the New York Times article, at any rate, was trying to address that particular question. And they posed a model in China that was so successful that went beyond simply the degrees. It was a transportation model. It was a human resource model where people who were committed could come to work at midnight, and it was the flexibility. It was the training that they had. What struck me as it relates to the topic we're discussing today is that the CEO of the Stephen Jobs successor, whose name now slips my mind,
Cook, yeah.
Was basically saying that it was the abundance of engineers, but not engineers in the way that we thought about them in the United States, that were available in China as a sort of steady stream and willing to come to work immediately and willing to take, to live in a dormitory. It was a whole different lifestyle that was there. So it was awakening to me, because it's not just the assembly plants that we think of with cheap labor and the internet and transportation. It was a whole different model of how you build something. As it related to higher education, they talked about an engineering 2-year degree, essentially, of people that they were calling engineers. And I guess, Phil, you're saying that this isn't working in India, but at least the gist of the article was that that was the rich resource that was available. And what it raised for me is, and I'm a believer in liberal arts myself, but it raised me as to whether or not our model is in fact an elitist model for training leaders, where we were and have been for the most part of the 20th century. But in the last couple of decades, it's possible that that model of training of higher education, we're no longer in that leadership role. We're no longer in the economic leadership role that we were before, and whether or not our higher education institutions are falling behind in training what they should be.
Yeah. Can I?
Please, Phil, and then Arden.
Just a brief comment on that. I also was very interested in that Times article, really very thought-provoking. Think of this, however. The Foxconn company that's received a lot of attention, which stimulates productivity and lots of suicides, is a model of human resource deployment, which is a little bit like the Marines, in which you get people to subject themselves, because they're making decent money by Chinese standards, to a lifestyle that you and I and graduates of colleges in the US or most other places wouldn't submit themselves to. Therefore, we are less competitive because of that model. Now, will in the long run that be sustainable even in the Chinese context is questionable. As people in a globalized environment, watching television and so on, do we want to subject ourselves to that kind of arrangement? And already there are lots of strikes, some of which are reported and some of which not. So this is highly complex and goes way beyond higher education. But for the immediate future, what, you know, that article and the issues raised by it are of central importance to the economy. I don't know how much they're of central importance to how we organize higher education in this country.
Why not?
I just wonder. Because Americans are not going to go to live in a dormitory with 200,000 other young people and be willing to come when the boss says, it's 12 o'clock now, but we have an order from, from Apple in California, come on in and redesign. They were talking about the glass cover. Right. We got to do that right away. And then they can do it quicker than we can do it because of an authoritarian system. So, how do we handle that? Not easy.
I thought you'd change the question, right, your statement in the middle. At the end, you finished with the issue of the competitiveness. And I wonder, and Phil probably knows the answer much better than I do, whether we're losing our dominance in the market is different than losing our standing in the market. I'm not sure that we're losing our quality as much as the competition's growing, which is maybe a good thing, because there's certainly places where there's a great need for high quality education. So if there's more people doing it, I'm not sure we lose at the end of the day with that. We're afraid of it, we may lose, but I'm not sure we do. But the other question you brought about is the structure of higher education. So again, going back to your question about the liberal arts and schools of education, the tension between CAS and School of Education, I will suggest that I think we're going to move towards more models where scaffolding the college students' ability to apply what they've learned in a liberal education into practice will become increasingly part of our responsibility. Certainly what employers are telling us, that they end up doing it. So IBM will tell you how many people they train a year, right? Yeah. IBM's a huge university because everyone comes out of their bachelor's degree and then they get trained to do the work. And increasingly, I think we're going to be expected to do that. So our students in a flatter world are better able to find places of employment. And I think we'll end up having some responsibilities there. Hopefully not by decreasing the quality of our liberal education, but adding that scaffolding piece systematically, and not, historically we've given that to someone's office off in a corner. I think those offices where our students do their volunteer work, where they do their community services, where they learn how to apply or become leaders, will be seen more within the core of the university. One of the things I've been impressed since coming here is the number of clubs. So if you're an a cappella singer at the Boston University, there are 20 groups. Right, which is wonderful to begin with, but it means that there's 20 leaders of those groups. So we have students who may be history majors, comm majors, who then get these leadership opportunities, and I think universities are going to take that more seriously and actually acknowledge that as part of a student's progress towards degree or publications that will be seen as having more practical soft skill development than we get credit for.
Sally?
And just to elaborate on that point too, I think leaders of clubs are still within a university environment. What I see is an increasing movement toward leaders of people outside the university by students. And I look at the number of students, and again, US universities, and maybe the more elite ones are the ones I'm more familiar with, but I'm seeing this growing number of opportunities for community engagement and solving real problems, and also an increased number of social entrepreneurs when there are no jobs, And you're finding that 1 million people seem to have the same skill set, but you have innovative ideas. Sometimes people manage to pull companies out of these really bad economic situations, or technologies that can help thousands. And so I kind of maintain my half full glass attitude, even within the context of a very critical and important conversation.
Please, if you identify yourself, just start off.
I'm Stephanie Watts. I'm a former Pardee research fellow, and I teach in the Honors College, a course in corporate accountability. But my primary affiliation is in the School of Management, where I'm in the IT department, IS. And I wanted to raise the issue around a conflict that I see cultural conflict really, between the students that I teach in the business school and the students that I teach and get exposed to in other areas, the Honors College, et cetera. So there has been research that's found that business school students' moral reasoning actually goes down over their tenure at a business school because they're taught systematically that they have to, in a sense, ignore their values in order to serve the bottom line. So the rest of the students are not taught this, but the systemic problem I wanted to raise, because I don't think there's been a lot of discussion anywhere about it, and it's something I've heard from other faculty at other universities, is that we are getting evaluated by these students. So my performance review, my tenure, promotion, et cetera, is based on a good deal to do with what those students say about me. So what I've found is increasingly students are less and less tolerant of I tend to insert sort of civic value material in my classes, even though it's not directly related to information systems and business, as we all do, because we're engaging these students. But the students are not responding well, so that affects my performance evaluation, so that makes me less influential within the school. So what I wanted to raise is the performance evaluation system and having the inmates running the asylum, as it were, and see if you had any comments on that.
Thoughts about thank you for that question. Your thoughts about performance evaluation.
Can I had to, I mean, in K-12, obviously accountability, teacher effectiveness is the big conversation. And one of the fascinating things that that recently been discovered is that student evaluation of teachers, when high school, middle school teachers are allowed to evaluate the teachers, is predictive of that teacher's effectiveness on actual outcomes. So that student feedback loop, which I think is bothersome sometimes, because when do you pander? I always love getting low marks because it means I'm not pandering completely to the group. But it really is predictive in high school of students' ability to perform in academic settings. So I think that conversation is important. How we use it, however, I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that a highly demanding teacher who's asking people to get out of their comfort zone should be identified. So part of any performance evaluation at any level should be understanding the syllabus by your mentors, classroom visits by your other professors, so they can see what the student's experience is firsthand, in addition to reading the comments and looking at the marks.
I would just add the thought that what we measure matters and has influence, and that is a broader topic. And indeed, apropos our subject today, I would suggest to you that it's an area of exciting potential creativity to invent, design, test out new indicators that get at some of the gnawing problems and some of the patterns of innovation. Because clearly the available data that we have, the available measures, don't speak directly to most of our claims and counterclaims in this conversation. We have time for one more comment or question from the audience, and then I want to ask our panel to wrap up by giving your answer to the following question. If you had the opportunity to make a recommendation to the Minister of Education or to her Deputy Secretary in charge of higher education, or to the head of a university you select the part of the world, about how they steer their institutions or the higher education sector, what would be your single most significant prod or recommendation? Please.
Yes. I'm Shelley Hawks. I'm an independent historian, a China specialist, and I was interested in the panel's comments about the emotional and social and cognitive benefits of foreign language learning in the United States. And I would propose that there's really a window of opportunity for our children that in terms of learning languages. And many of our best school systems don't teach foreign languages to elementary students, and they start in middle school and then in high school. And our universities do a good job, but by that time there's so much in their curriculum that it's very difficult to actually turn out very proficient students who are very good at secondary languages. And for example, right now in the United States, the SAT reports that only 3% of our high school seniors that are college bound take Chinese, whereas 70% take Spanish. And so this is just something I'd like you to address.
Your thoughts?
Well, just one comment, and I could go on at great length because I've done some work on this. English is the global language of most everything. And as a result of that, we in the English-speaking world have become exceedingly lazy about foreign language. And the British and the Americans have always been exceedingly lazy, actually, but we've gotten worse if you look at patterns of development. And of course, the numbers of students who are taking what we call non-traditional languages, which happen to be spoken by the large majority of people in the world, is infinitesimally small. What can we do about that? We're not doing anything about it at the moment. And with the problem, Hardin knows more about these, Matt, with problems of school budgets and so on, some of these programs for Chinese language and culture, for example, are even being cut back. So it's a big problem. There is less emphasis in higher education on foreign language learning. Many of our elite colleges insist on some training in foreign languages, but it's generally not terrible, but people don't come away from it with a real working knowledge. So it's not a happy scene. The good part about it is that in business, in commerce, in science, in higher education, you can get along with English. The bad part about it is to know a culture, you've got to know the language.
Well said. Your concluding recommendations to leaders in higher education about their future. Sally.
I would say pithily, right, reverse order. Why didn't you tell me that to begin with? That they should look beyond the university for the future of the university. I think that it has to, our whole discussion, including your questions, which I thought were wonderful, points to the locus of the university within a larger community, within that global environment. And I would say look to that to find the shape of what must be inside.
Yep. Hardin.
It's a tough question. I didn't know I was going to get tested. And I haven't had my lunch, is that excuse? It's very hard to pick among the many possibilities, but I tend to move towards governance as a major issue in the quality of any institution. And one of the things that we have to really think through, I think corporate governance, university governance, is in a flat world with increased communication, increased knowledge. Yeah. How do we organize around a flatter world that is not so hierarchically oriented, particularly budgeting issues? And how do you think about institutions that are governed by the needs and perspective of students and faculty in a collegial relationship and organized by the institution to provide? Because that tends to be, I would think that my juniors and seniors, and my graduate students, and my junior faculty probably have more wisdom than they get credit for, and we don't organize around what they know. And I think that would be a very important way to think about how to stay connected and they have the energy to do something different.
Good. Thank you. Phil.
There's no universal advice that can be given because the particular problems of ministers and their countries vary so much. I do have the opportunity to actually sit with a minister on a regular basis in Saudi Arabia who asks me such kind of questions, and I don't think I give him the answers that he wants because I'm frequently saying, well, it's very complicated, as indeed it is. My advice would be in some ways the opposite of yours, which is focus on the, pay attention to the institution. Part of its governance, part of it is the management of the academic profession, part of it is students, which we've been talking about here, and so on. I don't disagree at all with what you said, but getting a university that works in much of the world is a severe challenge. Partly it's resources, not in Saudi Arabia, but a lot of it is just the organization of the pattern, and a lot of it also is telling the minister to keep your bloody hands off the details and let them have some kind of autonomy. But very deep question that you asked.
I've decided to make my recommendation to the CEO of a large internationally interested foundation that has a concern with the future of higher education. And what I would tell her is create an initiative that challenges and supports people. Maybe they're based in universities, maybe they're partnerships outside of university, to entirely rethink how we deliver and pay for post-secondary higher education. Because I don't think a lot day to day about the financial question that we've talked about a little bit, but this conversation leaves me thinking that I need to spend much more energy and collaboration with others on that fundamental dimension. And I know from my own lifetime of working with for institutions of higher education that it's terribly difficult to be creative and really get at fundamental financial change. And I'm convinced that the only way we're going to really make headway on some of the financial issues that you all have spoken to so clearly is by inviting and promoting dramatic rethinking and wholly new experiments that aren't constrained by the realities of my employers and our employers. Thank you all so much for your participation and for your thoughtful comments and questions. And please join me in thanking our panel.